They say civilization began in Sumer, but what if it didn't? What if the monumental cities of Uruk were not humanity's first great achievement, but merely echoes of something far older, something now buried, not only beneath millennia of earth, but beneath layers of an almost sacred silence? A deliberate quietude in the historical record, as if the world itself was never meant to recall its true origins. Why do the earliest myths whisper not of primitive beginnings, but of survivors of a world lost, not to mere forgetfulness, but to a systematic erasure? Tonight, we trace those faint, unsettling clues through broken tablets, forbidden symbols, and the unexplained gaps in a narrative too neatly told. We follow the outline of a story long denied, the possibility that human civilization didn't start in Sumer, but was inherited from an ancient race whose identity has been meticulously forgotten. The silence was wrong. Dr. Charles Leonard Woolley had spent enough years digging through the remains of dead civilizations to know what emptiness should sound like. The quiet rustle of sand shifting through broken pottery, the hollow echo when your shovel strikes a buried wall, the whispered collapse of ancient mud brick crumbling back to dust. But standing in the excavation pit at your inn 1922, surrounded by walls that shouldn't exist, Woolley heard something else. A silence that felt deliberate, as if someone had carefully erased every sound that might explain what he was looking at. 6 feet down, where he expected to find the scattered bones of humanity learning to build, he found perfection instead. Streets laid out in precise grids, drainage systems engineered with mathematical precision, walls that ran straight and true for hundreds of yards, their foundations cut deep into bedrock with the confidence of builders who had never known failure. This was supposed to be one of mankind's first attempts at city building, but it looked like someone had been practicing for centuries. Woolley lifted a cuneiform tablet from the dirt. Tax records written in neat columns, cataloguing grain shipments and livestock inventories with bureaucratic efficiency that wouldn't be out of place in a modern office. The clay was still warm from the desert sun, but the knowledge pressed into its surface was older than anything human civilization was supposed to possess. He stood there in that trench holding evidence that made no sense and felt the first crack appear in everything. Archaeology had taught him about how societies begin, because cities don't emerge like this. They stumble into existence over generations, leaving behind the debris of countless mistakes. Collapsed walls, failed experiments, the archaeological poetry of trial and error. You should be able to trace their growth like rings in a tree, each layer showing how the builders learned from the previous generation's failures. But here, beneath 4 millennia of sand, lay a blueprint that seemed to have skipped the learning entirely. The pattern repeated itself everywhere they dug. At Uruk, archaeologists had uncovered a metropolis housing nearly 80,000 people, complete with specialized districts for craftsmen, merchants, and priests. Monumental ziggurats rose from the city center like geometric mountains, their stepped sides climbing toward heaven with an architectural confidence that should have taken centuries to develop. Administrative archives recorded complex legal proceedings. Schools taught standardized curricula to young scribes. Workshops produced goods according to specifications so precise they suggested industrial-level quality control. And all of it, every system, every innovation, every leap forward appeared simultaneously around 3200 BC, as if someone had drawn up plans for an entire civilization and then built it in a single, coordinated effort in the lamplight of his tent that evening. Woolley spread out his drawings and tried to make sense of what felt increasingly like a magician's trick. How do you make a civilization appear without showing your work? The mathematics alone defied explanation. The Sumerians hadn't just stumbled onto a working number system. They had created something elegant. Their basic C mathematics allowed for complex calculations with fractions and large numbers. A system so sophisticated we still use it today when we divide hours into minutes and circles into degrees. This wasn't the kind of practical counting you develop while tallying sheep. This was theoretical mathematics. The product of minds that understood abstract principles our own civilization didn't rediscover until the Renaissance. And then there was the astronomy. Night after night, Sumerian observers had tracked the movements of planets across the sky with an accuracy that seemed impossible without telescopes. They knew Venus was a single object, whether it appeared as morning or evening star. They distinguished Saturn from the surrounding stars despite its barely visible glow. They predicted eclipses and calculated celestial cycles with mathematical precision. Where had they learned to see the sky like that? Who had taught them to recognize patterns in the darkness that took other cultures millennia to discover? At Eridu, the city Sumerians themselves claimed was the first ever built, the mystery deepened into something approaching dread. Beneath the main temple, archaeologists had uncovered 17 construction layers, each built directly atop the last. But these weren't the random additions you'd expect from a building that evolved over time. Each layer followed the exact same architectural plan, the same proportions, the same orientation, the same careful attention to astronomical alignments. 17 times across centuries, builders had climbed these steps, measured these angles, and laid these foundation stones. 17 times they had chosen absolute fidelity over innovation, preservation over progress. It was as if they were terrified of forgetting something. Standing among those ruins today, you can feel the weight of that repetition. The obsessive precision of architects who refused to deviate from a pattern they couldn't or wouldn't explain. What were they so desperate to remember? And what were they so afraid of losing? The conventional story goes like this. Around 3500 BCE, nomadic tribes settled in the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates. Agricultural surplus led to population growth, which created the need for social organization, which eventually resulted in civilization. It's clean, logical, and fits comfortably in textbooks. But when you dig past the surface, the evidence begins to resist. Where are the failures? The experimental phase when humans were figuring out how to be civilized. Every other culture leaves behind this archaeological trail of learning. Pottery that gradually improves, tools that slowly evolve, buildings that grow more sophisticated over generations. In Sumer, the earliest layers accessible to archaeologists already show remarkable sophistication. The first cuneiform tablets aren't primitive scratches. They're standardized records written in organized script, complete with mathematical calculations and legal terminology. The earliest irrigation channels aren't simple ditches. They're engineered waterways with locks, gates, and distribution systems. It's as if the Sumerians began their civilization at version 5.0, never bothering with the messy process of learning what version 1.0 should look like. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery is what lies beneath Sumer's foundations, or rather, what doesn't, in the deepest layers archaeologists can reach. They don't find the ancestors of Sumerian civilization. They find absence, not the natural emptiness of uninhabited places, but something that feels deliberately cleaned, swept, prepared. It's like walking into a house where someone has carefully removed all the family photos, leaving behind only the faint outlines on the walls where frames once hung. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this emptiness. Their creation myths don't describe civilization's gradual development. They tell stories of a knowledge being delivered complete and perfect by beings they called the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven. The word choice is telling. Not those who always were or those who emerged from among us, but those who came down. The language suggests arrival, not origin. Contact, not creation. According to these ancient texts, the Anunnaki taught humanity the arts of civilization: writing, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture, law. Every innovation appears simultaneously in the archaeological record, as if someone had downloaded an entire cultural operating system into human consciousness. Most scholars interpret these myths as symbolic humanity's tendency to attribute mysterious knowledge to divine intervention. But what if the Sumerians were describing something else? What if they were preserving a memory of learning, not from gods, but from teachers whose origins had been forgotten? The myths describe something the Sumerians called the Me, divine laws or cosmic principles that weren't created but recovered, retrieved from chaos, restored to order, rebuilt from memory. That word, rebuilt, echoes through Sumerian literature like a confession. They weren't inventing civilization. They were reconstructing it. But reconstructing it from what? And based on whose memory? Standing in the ruins of yore as the sun sets over the Iraqi desert, you can feel the weight of these questions. The mathematical precision of the walls, the perfect alignment of the temples, the sense that everything here was built according to plans drawn by architects who were no longer available for questions. And in that silence, that same deliberate silence, Woolley first noticed a century ago. You begin to understand what's really missing from our story of human civilization. We're not looking at humanity's first cities. We're looking at its first reconstruction project, which means somewhere, buried deeper than we've yet dared to dig, lie the blueprints for everything we think we invented ourselves, the original plans for civilization waiting in the darkness. Like a door we're not sure we want to open. Because if Sumer wasn't the beginning, if it was just the first attempt to rebuild something that came before, then every assumption we've made about human history might be wrong. All of it might be nothing more than the echoes of a memory we've been trying to forget. If that's true, we have to ask, what are we really rebuilding? Who taught us the plans? And why does the thought of finding the original blueprints fill us with a dread we can't quite name? The clay tablet trembled in Professor Samuel Noah Kramer's hands, and for a moment he couldn't tell if it was the tablet or his fingers that were shaking. It was 1956, deep in the basement archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, where thousands of cuneiform tablets sat in climate-controlled silence, waiting to surrender their secrets. Kramer had spent 30 years coaxing meaning from these ancient voices, translating the bureaucratic whispers of a dead civilization, tax records, marriage contracts, grain inventories, the mundane poetry of people learning to organize their world with scratches in clay. But this tablet was different. Not because of what it said, a routine business agreement between merchants in ancient Umma, but because of how impossibly well it said it. Every wedge-shaped mark pressed into the clay with surgical precision. Every symbol following grammatical rules so sophisticated they wouldn't be out of place in a modern linguistics textbook. Every line organized in columns that demonstrated not just literacy but institutional memory codified in clay. The carbon dating placed this tablet at roughly 3200 BCE, making it one of humanity's earliest attempts at written communication. Except it didn't look like an attempt. It looked like a masterpiece. Kramer set the tablet on his desk with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence of a crime he couldn't quite name. Outside, Philadelphia hummed with the confident noise of modern civilization. Down here, in the artificial twilight of the archives, something whispered that humanity's relationship with writing was not what we pretended it to be. How do you invent perfection on the first try? The question had been haunting him for years, growing louder with each tablet he translated. Because cuneiform wasn't just functional, it was elegant. Not just communicative, but systematic. A fully realized technology for capturing human thought. Deployed with the confidence of people who had never seen writing fail. And that confidence was what disturbed him most. Languages are supposed to stumble into existence. They begin as grunts and gestures, devolve into words, gradually develop grammar, slowly learn to represent abstract concepts. Writing systems should show even more evolutionary debris, the archaeological remains of people, figuring out how to make marks represent sounds, how to organize symbols into meaning, how to transform the chaotic flow of human speech into something that could survive on clay. But the Sumerian record was surgically clean. Kramer walked to the archive's main catalogue, his footsteps echoing in the underground chamber like whispers in a tomb. Row after row of tablets stretched into the shadows, each one a witness to the same impossible fact. Humanity's oldest writing system showed no signs of being young. He pulled another tablet from its protective housing, a legal document from Lagash that dealt with water rights between neighboring cities. The language was dense with technical terminology, legal precedents, and bureaucratic protocols. The syntax was flawless, the vocabulary precise enough to handle complex negotiations involving multiple parties, standardized measurements, and conditional clauses. This wasn't primitive communication. This was institutional sophistication crystallized in clay. And it bothered him that no one else seemed bothered by this. The conventional story, the one taught in every archaeology classroom, goes like this. Around 3200 BC, Sumerian merchants needed to track increasingly complex transactions. Necessity mothered invention. Simple pictographs gradually evolved into abstract symbols. Over time, these symbols began representing sounds instead of objects. Eventually, you have writing. It's clean, logical, satisfying. It's also wrong, because pictographs, when they exist in the archaeological record, don't show gradual evolution into cuneiform. They show up sporadically, inconsistently, with no clear developmental relationship to the sophisticated script that emerges fully formed around 3200 BCE. It's like finding a few random sketches and then claiming they explain the Sistine Chapel. The evolutionary stages are missing. The transitional forms don't exist. The obvious mistakes that should litter any learning process are absent from the record. Just perfection appearing from nowhere, like a door opening in a wall you didn't know was there. Kramer returned to his desk and opened his translation notes. Pages upon pages of careful analysis that had consumed decades of his life. The more he studied Sumerian grammar, the more convinced he became that these scribes weren't inventing a writing system. They were following one. The language showed structural sophistication that seemed impossible for a first draft. Verb conjugations that handled subtle temporal relationships most languages take millennia to develop. Noun classifications that reveal deep philosophical thinking about the nature of reality. Syntactic rules flexible enough to express everything from mundane accounting to cosmic poetry. and all of it appeared simultaneously, as if someone had downloaded an entire linguistic operating system into human consciousness. He pulled up his translations of the earliest school tablets, exercises from the Edinburgh, the Sumerian tablet houses, where young scribes learned their craft. But even these educational materials troubled him. Students weren't experimenting with new ways to represent sound and meaning. They were memorizing thousands of lines of predetermined text, mathematical tables, legal formulas, religious hymns, astronomical observations. Education as preservation, not exploration. What were they preserving? And why did preservation feel so urgent? In the growing darkness of the archive, Kramer found himself thinking about silence, the particular quality of quiet that fills spaces where important things have been deliberately removed. It was the same silence he'd noticed in the archaeological record beneath the earliest cuneiform tablets. No practice runs, no experimental symbols, no evidence of a civilization learning to write, just absence, and then suddenly perfection. The Sumerians had a word for their writing system, Sa. It meant to write, but also to place in order and to remember. The same root appeared in words for preservation, restoration, and reconstruction, as if writing itself was not about creation, but about preventing something from being lost. Not invention, salvation. Kramer closed his eyes and tried to imagine the first Sumerian scribe sitting in some long-buried chamber, pressing a reed stylus into wet clay. What had that moment felt like? The thrill of discovery, the satisfaction of invention, or the weight of responsibility, knowing you were the last link in a chain that stretched back to teachers whose names had already been forgotten. Because the more he studied these tablets, the more convinced he became that cuneiform wasn't humanity's first writing system. It was humanity's first backup drive. The myths supported this interpretation. Sumerian creation stories didn't describe writing being invented. They described it being recovered. The me, those cosmic principles that governed civilization, weren't created by humans. They were retrieved from chaos, restored to order, transmitted by the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Most scholars interpreted these myths as symbolic explanations for cultural innovation. But sitting in that archive, surrounded by tablets that whispered of knowledge too perfect to have been learned from scratch, Kramer began to wonder if the Sumerians were describing something more literal. What if they weren't writing creation myths? What if they were writing user manuals? Instructions for preserving knowledge that was already ancient when the first cuneiform tablet was pressed. Guidelines for maintaining systems that had been designed by minds the Sumerians could remember only in fragments and metaphors. He opened another tablet. Astronomical observations that tracked planetary movements with mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. The same scribes who recorded grain shipments were mapping the cosmos using a writing system sophisticated enough to handle both mundane accounting and celestial mechanics. From day one, what kind of culture invents writing and immediately points it toward the stars? The kind that isn't inventing anything. The kind that's trying to remember. The silence in the archive pressed against him like a weight. Thousands of tablets, millions of carefully pressed symbols, centuries of preserved knowledge, all of it feeling like an echo of something larger that had been speaking in a voice we could no longer hear. And then cuneiform simply vanished from history. Not gradually, not through evolution into other scripts, but cleanly, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, as if the backup process was complete. Kramer sat back in his chair and let the question form that would haunt him for the rest of his career. If the Sumerians were preserving rather than creating, what exactly were they trying so desperately not to forget? Because somewhere in the silence before the first tablet, something had been worth preserving. Something important enough to encode in wedge-shaped marks and bury in desert sand for future civilizations to discover. Something we might still be trying to remember one translated symbol at a time. And if that was true, if the world's oldest writing system was actually a preservation project disguised as an invention, then the real question wasn't how the Sumerians learned to write. It was who taught them what to remember. The sudden appearance of perfection in Sumerian civilization, in their writing, their urban planning, their administrative systems, challenges the very linearity of human progress. It whispers of a preceding intelligence, an ancient race that laid the groundwork, that transmitted their operating system of civilization. This isn't just a deviation from the expected curve. It's a direct contradiction, a historical anomaly so profound that its implications shattered the comfortable narrative of human ingenuity building gradually from scratch, the surgical cleanliness of the archaeological record, the absence of trial and error, the immediate deployment of sophisticated knowledge. These are not the hallmarks of a nascent society. They are the fingerprints of inherited wisdom, a curriculum downloaded rather than discovered. And the dread Woolley and Kramer felt in the face of such evidence was the primal human fear of realizing that our story might not be our own, that our beginnings are perhaps just midpoints in a much larger, forgotten saga. A saga dictated by teachers whose names have been erased, but whose lessons still echo in the very foundations of our world. We are living their sequel, reading their user manual, but without the original context, without the full understanding of the architects of our earliest civilization, the night sky above Mesopotamia in 3000 BCE was darker than anything we can imagine now. No light pollution, no artificial glow washing out the stars. Just infinite blackness punctuated by thousands of points of light, each one a mystery waiting to be solved by minds that had never seen a telescope, never held a compass, never even conceived of the wheel. Dr. Hermann Unger knew this darkness intimately. He had spent 40 years studying ancient astronomy, translating Babylonian star charts in the climate-controlled silence of Vienna's Academy of Sciences. But on this particular evening in 1998, as he held a photograph of a tablet that would change everything he thought he knew about human civilization, Hunger felt the same vertigo that must have gripped those ancient skywatchers as they realized they were staring into infinity. The tablet was catalogued as VAT 4956, a Babylonian copy of much older Sumerian observations. But what made Hunger's hands tremble wasn't its age. It was its accuracy. The tablet contained a complete astronomical diary for the year 568 BCE, with detailed observations of planetary positions, lunar phases, and stellar configurations. But buried in those calculations was something that shouldn't exist. Mathematical precision that matched modern values to within fractions of a second. The synodic month, the time between successive full moons, was recorded as 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3.3 seconds. Modern astronomy puts it at 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 2.9 seconds, a difference of less than half a second. Calculated by people who measured time with water, clocks, and shadows. Hunger set the photograph down and walked to his office window, staring out at the Vienna skyline while a question formed that would haunt him. For years, How do you achieve that level of precision without instruments that won't be invented for 3,000 years? Because this wasn't just one lucky guess. The tablet represented the culmination of astronomical traditions that stretched back to Sumer, a continuous chain of observation and calculation that began when writing itself was barely a few centuries old, and every link in that chain showed the same impossible characteristic: accuracy that exceeded the tools available to achieve it. The Venus observations were the most troubling. Venus doesn't behave like other celestial objects. It disappears from the sky for weeks at a time, shifts dramatically between morning and evening appearances, and follows an 8-year cycle so complex that most ancient cultures never recognized it as a single planet. The Greeks called it two different stars, Phosphorus and Hesperos, and didn't realize their mistake until the 6th century BCE. But the Sumerians knew. Not only did they understand that the morning star and evening star were the same celestial body, they tracked its complete cycle with mathematical precision. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, copied from older Sumerian sources, recorded 21 years of Venus observations with data so accurate that modern astronomers use it to date ancient chronologies. How does a civilization that's just learning to write immediately begin mapping one of the most complex planetary motions visible from Earth? Hunger pulled up his translation notes, pages covered with careful analysis of cuneiform astronomical texts. The more he studied these ancient observations, the more convinced he became that something fundamental was missing from our understanding of how knowledge develops. Because knowledge is supposed to evolve gradually, astronomers should start by noticing obvious patterns, the phases of the moon, the changing position of the sun, before moving on to subtler observations like planetary motion and eclipse prediction. You expect to find crude early attempts refined over generations into increasingly sophisticated understanding. But the Sumerian astronomical record showed no such evolution. The earliest observations they made were also the most accurate. Later copies made by Babylonians and Assyrians actually showed declining precision, as if each generation understood less about what they were copying than the one before. It was backwards. Instead of knowledge improving over time, it seemed to be degrading, like a photograph of a photograph of a photograph, each copy losing resolution until the original image became unrecognizable. The mathematical sophistication troubled him most. The Sumerians used a basic number system that allowed for complex calculations, involving fractions and angular measurements. This sexagesimal system was so elegant and practical that we still use it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. But why base 60? Most counting systems develop organically from human anatomy. Base 10 from our fingers, base 20 from fingers and toes. It's perfect for astronomical calculations, allowing precise division of time and space without the messy fractions that plague other numerical systems. It's as if the Sumerians designed their mathematics specifically for astronomy, or as if their mathematics had been designed by minds that already understood what astronomical calculations would require. The star catalogues presented another puzzle. Sumerian astronomers didn't just observe celestial objects. They classified them. They distinguished between stars and planets, recognized that planets followed different paths across the sky, and grouped stars into constellations that we still use today. They understood that some stars never moved relative to each other, while others, the wandering stars or planets, traced complex paths against the stellar background. This kind of systematic observation required institutional memory spanning generations. Someone had to watch the same patch of sky night after night, year after year, decade after decade, carefully noting the smallest changes in position and brightness. And someone had to maintain those records, ensuring that the knowledge accumulated by one generation could be passed intact to the next. But where were the institutions that could support such long-term observation? The Sumerians had temples but no universities. They had scribes but no professional astronomers. They had cities but no observatories. How do you maintain precise astronomical observations across centuries without the institutional infrastructure that precision requires? The silence outside Hunger's office felt different now, pregnant with the weight of questions that had no comfortable answers. In his desk drawer lay dozens of similar tablets, each one a witness to the same impossible fact. Humanity's oldest astronomical records were also its most accurate. He thought about the ancient observers themselves, standing on the flat rooftops of Sumerian cities, watching the eternal dance of lights in the desert sky. What had driven them to such patient observation? What had taught them which patterns mattered and which could be ignored? What had given them the confidence to build their entire civilization around astronomical calculations that required centuries to verify? Because that's what they had done. Sumerian agriculture depended on precise calendar calculations. Their religious festivals were timed to astronomical events. Their kings claimed legitimacy through celestial portents. Their entire culture was synchronized to the rhythm of the cosmos in a way that suggested deep, systematic understanding of how the sky worked. This wasn't casual stargazing. This was applied astronomy, put to work in service of civilization itself. And it was there from the beginning, fully formed, as if someone had handed the Sumerians a complete astronomical manual and said, "Here, build your civilization around this." The myths supported this interpretation. Sumerian creation stories described the Anunnaki teaching humanity to read the stars, to track the movements of celestial bodies, to calculate the passage of time itself. The god Marduk was said to have established the constellations and set the calendar that governed earthly affairs. Most scholars interpreted these myths as symbolic explanations for cultural innovations. But sitting in his office, surrounded by tablets that whispered of knowledge too precise to have been achieved through trial and error, Hunger began to wonder if the Sumerians were describing something more literal. What if they weren't creating astronomical mythology? What if they were preserving astronomical instruction? Because the alternative, that the Sumerians achieved mathematical and observational precision rivaling modern astronomy through nothing but patience and naked eye. Observation seemed to violate everything we knew about how knowledge develops. Knowledge builds gradually. It accumulates through countless small observations, refined over generations into increasingly sophisticated understanding. But Sumerian astronomy appeared fully formed, like a gift that came with its own instruction manual. The implications were unsettling. If the Sumerians hadn't developed their astronomical knowledge through gradual observation, then someone must have taught them. Someone who already understood planetary motions, eclipse cycles, and stellar positions with mathematical precision. Someone who had already solved the problems of celestial mechanics that would challenge human civilization for thousands of years. And if that was true, if Sumerian astronomy was inherited rather than invented, then we had to ask, who were the teachers? Where did they learn to read the stars with such precision? And why does their knowledge feel like an echo of observations made by minds we can no longer imagine under skies we can no longer see? Hunger closed his translation notes and sat in the growing darkness of his office, listening to the silence that fills spaces where important questions have no comfortable answers. Outside, Vienna's lights blurred the stars into irrelevance, hiding the same cosmic dance that had captivated Sumerian observers 5,000 years ago. But those ancient watchers had seen something we had lost. They had possessed knowledge we were still trying to reconstruct. And in their careful recordings, pressed into clay tablets and buried in desert sand, they had left us a map to mysteries we didn't yet know how to read. Because if their eyes couldn't see what they recorded with such precision, we had to ask whose eyes did. And why does the thought of finding those original observers fill us with the same mixture of wonder and unease that must have gripped the first Sumerian astronomer as he realized he was mapping infinity with nothing but clay and starlight? The shadow falls exactly where it always has. Dr. Margaret Whitney stood at the base of the ziggurat of your, watching 4,000 years of sunlight paint the same geometric pattern across the desert. Sand that it had painted every winter solstice since the temple was built. The ancient bricks, crumbling and sun-bleached, still cast their shadow with the precision of a sundial, marking time according to astronomical calculations pressed into clay when mammoths still walked the earth. But this wasn't a sundial. It was something far more troubling. Whitney had spent 80 years studying Mesopotamian architecture, and the more she understood about ziggurat construction, the more convinced she became that these massive stepped pyramids weren't built for the living. They were built for memory itself. Architectural monuments designed to preserve knowledge that couldn't be trusted to human transmission alone. The question that haunted her was simple. Memory of what? Because ziggurats weren't accidents of ancient engineering. They were instruments built with mathematical precision and astronomical alignment that suggested their creators understood principles of celestial mechanics. Most civilizations wouldn't discover for millennia. Every measurement had meaning. Every angle served a purpose. Every alignment pointed toward knowledge we could no longer decipher. The ziggurat of your rose before her like a man-made mountain. It stepped sides, climbing toward heaven in carefully calculated proportions. 70 feet tall in its current ruined state. It had originally soared over 100 feet into the Mesopotamian sky. Its upper platform positioned to track the movements of Venus across the night sky. This particular temple had been built around 2100 BCE under King U. But Whitney's archaeological survey suggested it followed blueprints far older than its construction date. The foundation measurements, the staircase orientations, the astronomical alignments, all of it matched patterns found in ziggurats across Sumer, as if every builder had access to the same master plan. A plan that seemed to encode knowledge nobody could explain. She walked around the temple's base, noting the precision of its cardinal alignment. The corners pointed almost exactly north, south, east, and west, an achievement that required sophisticated understanding of astronomy and geometry. The 3 staircases that climbed its sides faced specific celestial rising points, and the entire structure was positioned to serve as a massive observatory for tracking planetary motions. But observing what, exactly, and for whom? In the growing heat of the Iraqi morning, Whitney found herself thinking about the peculiar consistency of ziggurat construction across time and space. From Uruk to Eridu to Nippur, every major Sumerian city had built one of these stepped pyramids. Different sizes, different kings, different centuries, but the same essential design. It wasn't variation on a theme. It was repetition of a pattern, preserved with a kind of obsessive fidelity that suggested the builders were following instructions they couldn't afford to misinterpret. The mathematical proportions were what troubled her most. Recent LiDAR scanning had revealed that ziggurat dimensions followed precise geometric ratios, relationships between height, width, and volume that corresponded to astronomical cycles and mathematical constants that wouldn't be formally defined until classical Greece. These weren't arbitrary architectural choices. These were encoded formulas built into brick and mortar to ensure their preservation across centuries of cultural change. But formulas for what? Whitney climbed the ancient stairs, each step worn smooth by 4 millennia of feet following the same ascending path. The climb was deliberate, designed to create specific sightlines and viewing angles that aligned with celestial events. Halfway up, she paused to examine a section of wall where clay tablets had been embedded directly into the brickwork. Astronomical observations literally built into the temple's structure. This was architecture as information storage, stone and clay serving as backup drives for knowledge that someone had been desperate to preserve. View from the ziggurat's upper platform was breathtaking in its strategic clarity. The entire Mesopotamian plain stretched to the horizon, with sightlines carefully calculated to track the rising points of stars and planets. Ancient astronomers standing here would have had an unobstructed view of celestial events, with the temple itself serving as a massive instrument for measuring cosmic time. But the alignments were wrong for the current era. Using astronomical software, Whitney had calculated that the ziggurat's orientations made perfect sense for stellar positions as they appeared 4,000 years ago, but had since drifted due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis, a phenomenon called axial precession. The temple wasn't aligned to the present sky. It was aligned to an ancient memory of how the sky used to look, which raised an uncomfortable question. How had Sumerian builders known to account for precession, a celestial phenomenon so subtle it takes advanced mathematics and centuries of observation to detect? The silence on the platform felt deliberate, pregnant with the weight of questions that had no comfortable answers. Whitney pulled out her field notes and reviewed her analysis of ziggurat construction patterns. The evidence was undeniable. These temples followed design principles that seemed to encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge, mathematical relationships, and engineering techniques that appeared fully formed in the archaeological record. No experimental phases, no developmental stages, no evidence of trial and error, just perfection, implemented with the confidence of builders who were following instructions rather than inventing techniques. The repetition across cities was what convinced her that ziggurats served a function beyond religious ritual. Each temple was essentially identical in its fundamental design, as if every Sumerian city had received the same set of blueprints and instructions for construction. The variations were cosmetic, different sizes, different decorative elements, but the underlying pattern remained constant. It was like finding copies of the same book written in different languages, preserving identical information through different cultural expressions. But who had written the original book? And why had preservation been so important that entire civilizations dedicated their greatest architectural achievements to maintaining its instructions? The Sumerian creation myths provided clues that most scholars interpreted as symbolic. Stories of the Anunnaki, teaching humanity to build temples that connected earth and heaven. Descriptions of divine knowledge encoded in sacred architecture, references to cosmic laws, the me, that governed everything from temple construction to royal succession. Whitney had always interpreted these myths as metaphorical explanations for cultural innovation. but standing on a platform built with astronomical precision that matched modern calculations, surrounded by evidence of mathematical knowledge that shouldn't have existed for centuries. She began to wonder if the Sumerians were describing something more literal. What if they weren't creating mythology about temple construction? What if they were preserving instruction about it? The silence pressed against her like a weight. Here, on this ancient platform, she could feel the presence of minds that had solved problems her own civilization was still working to understand. Architects who had encoded knowledge into stone with such precision that their calculations still worked 4,000 years later. Engineers who had built monuments designed to preserve memory across spans of time that exceeded human comprehension, and yet their identity had been erased as completely as if they had never existed. The ziggurat beneath her feet was more than a temple. It was a message written in the only language guaranteed to survive the collapse of civilizations, mathematics and stone. Its builders had understood that empires fall, languages die, and writing systems disappear. But geometric relationships endure. Astronomical alignments persist. Mathematical ratios survive. So they had built their knowledge into monuments designed to outlast. Memory itself, Whitney descended the ancient stairs as the sun climbed toward its zenith, casting shadows that fell, according to calculations pressed into clay tablets when humanity was supposedly just learning to write. Around the ziggurat base, tourists photographed ruins they didn't understand. Standing in the presence of encoded knowledge they couldn't read. The temple still functioned. Its alignments still tracked celestial events. Its proportions still embodied mathematical relationships that revealed their secrets to anyone with instruments, precise enough to measure them. But the meaning had been lost. The instructions had been forgotten. The memory the ziggurat was built to preserve had succumbed to the same forgetting it was designed to prevent, which meant that somewhere in the silence between what these monuments were built to remember and what we had learned to forget lay knowledge that had been considered important enough to encode in stone and preserve across millennia, knowledge that we might still be standing on, walking past, photographing as curiosities, never realizing we were in the presence of libraries written in a language of brick and astronomical alignment, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to read what their builders had been so desperate to preserve. And why does that possibility that we might be surrounded by encoded knowledge we lack the wisdom to interpret feel less like discovery and more like an inheritance we've misplaced? A memory we've been trying to recover without knowing what we lost. The stones of Sumer, aligned to stars as they were millennia ago, speak of an ancient race that possessed not just advanced astronomy, but a profound understanding of time itself, the slow, imperceptible shifts of the cosmos. Their monuments, their meticulous recordings, their very mathematical framework, are all testaments to a knowledge that appears to have bypassed the arduous process of human discovery, landing fully formed like a gift. A gift from whom? A forgotten race who saw not only the fragility of human memory but the enduring power of stone and sky as a medium for preservation. You check the time, 17 minutes past 2. The digital display on your phone reads 2:43 p.m., 2 hours. 43 minutes past noon. 60 seconds ticking by in each minute. 60 minutes accumulating in each hour. 360 degrees marking the complete rotation of Earth that creates each day. Numbers so familiar they're invisible, so embedded in the architecture of modern life that questioning them feels absurd, like asking why water is wet or why gravity pulls down instead of up. But Dr. Eleanor Robson had been asking exactly those questions for 15 years, and the answers were making her deeply uncomfortable. Sitting in her office at the Oriental Institute in Oxford, surrounded by photographs of Sumerian mathematical tablets that predated Pythagoras by 2 millennia, Robson felt the peculiar vertigo that comes from realizing that something you've taken for granted your entire life has no logical explanation. Why 60 seconds in a minute? Why 60 minutes in an hour? Why 360 degrees in a circle? The answer wasn't mathematical convenience or natural observation or practical necessity. The answer was Sumer. A civilization that had been dust for 3,000 years was still governing how every human being on Earth measured time and space, and nobody could explain why their system worked so perfectly that we never bothered to replace it. Robson lifted a photograph of tablet YBC 7289 from her desk. A simple clay square covered with cuneiform calculations that had changed her understanding of mathematical history. The tablet showed a square with diagonal lines and numerical annotations that demonstrated the Babylonians knew the relationship we call the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. But that wasn't what disturbed her about the tablet. What disturbed her was the precision of the calculations, all performed in base 60 mathematics with an elegance that suggested the system was already ancient when this particular scribe pressed his stylus into clay, because mathematical systems are supposed to evolve. They start simple and grow more sophisticated as civilizations develop more complex needs. You expect to find primitive counting methods gradually refined into advanced calculation techniques. But Sumerian mathematics showed no such evolution. The earliest tablets contained the most sophisticated applications of base 60 arithmetic, including complex fractional calculations, tables of reciprocity, and even approximations of irrational numbers that wouldn't be formally defined until classical Greece. It was backwards, like finding the most advanced features in the first version of a software program, with later versions somehow less capable than their predecessors. The sexagesimal system itself defied explanation. Base 60 was mathematically elegant, divisible by 12 different numbers, making fractional calculations simple and precise. But why had the Sumerians chosen it? Most counting systems develop organically from human anatomy, base 10 from counting on fingers, base 20 from adding toes. Base 60 seemed arbitrary until you realized its mathematical properties were perfectly suited for astronomical calculation and geometric measurement. It was as if the Sumerians had designed their number system specifically for applications they hadn't yet discovered, or as if the system had been designed by minds that already knew what those applications would require. Robson walked to her window and stared out at Oxford's ancient spires, thinking about the invisible presence of Sumerian mathematics in every aspect of modern life. GPS satellites calculated positions using coordinates measured in degrees and minutes. Computer processors synchronized. Operations using time measurements derived from base 60. Navigation systems, guided ships, and planes using angular calculations that traced back to cuneiform tablets pressed 5,000 years ago. The entire infrastructure of technological civilization was built on mathematical foundations laid by people who had never seen an airplane, never imagined a computer, never conceived of satellites orbiting Earth, yet their numerical system worked flawlessly for applications they couldn't have anticipated. How do you accidentally create a mathematical framework perfect for technologies that won't exist for millennia? The academic community preferred not to ask such questions. The standard explanation was practical necessity. Base 60 was useful for trade and timekeeping, so it persisted through cultural transmission. But this explanation ignored the fundamental problem of origin. Where were the earlier, less sophisticated versions? Where were the competing numerical systems that should have existed during the developmental phase? Where was the archaeological evidence of mathematical experimentation and refinement? The Sumerian tablets showed no such developmental history. Base 60 appeared fully formed in the earliest mathematical texts, complete with advanced applications that suggested institutional knowledge spanning generations. It was like discovering that the first book ever written was already a masterpiece. With no evidence of anyone learning to write, Robson returned to her desk and opened a file containing her analysis of Sumerian mathematical education. The tablets revealed a sophisticated pedagogical system where students memorized vast tables of numerical relationships, multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, square and cube tables, all calculated in base 60 with extraordinary precision. But these weren't rough approximations gradually refined through use. These were exact values calculated to multiple decimal places, using techniques that modern mathematicians recognized as sophisticated numerical analysis. The students weren't learning to discover mathematical relationships. They were learning to preserve them, which raised an unsettling question. Preserve them from what or from whom? In the silence of her office, Robson found herself thinking about the persistence of inherited knowledge. How certain pieces of information could survive the collapse of civilizations, transmitted from generation to generation, not because they were understood, but because they worked. Like genetic information passing from parent to child, carrying instructions for processes the conscious mind never comprehended. The Sumerian creation myths described the Anunnaki teaching humanity the me, divine laws that governed everything from kingship to craftsmanship to the measurement of time itself. Modern scholars interpreted these myths as symbolic explanations for cultural innovation. But what if the Sumerians were describing something more literal? What if they were preserving the memory of actual instruction, not from gods, but from teachers whose identity had been forgotten by the time the first mathematical tablets were written? Because the knowledge encoded in those tablets wasn't just advanced, it was specific. Mathematical techniques perfectly suited for astronomical calculation. Numerical systems optimized for complex engineering projects. Geometric principles that wouldn't be formally rediscovered until the Renaissance. This wasn't the kind of practical knowledge you develop while learning to count sheep or measure grain. This was theoretical mathematics, the product of minds that had already solved problems most civilizations would struggle with for centuries. And yet, there it was, pressed into clay tablets by scribes who worked with the casual confidence of people following well-established protocols rather than inventing new ones. The implications were staggering. Every time someone checked their watch, they were using a time measurement system designed by unknown minds for unknown purposes. Every GPS calculation relied on angular measurements that traced back to mathematical principles embedded in cuneiform tablets. Every circular measurement, from the wheels on cars to the orbits of satellites, used a 360-degree system whose origins disappeared into prehistoric silence. Modern civilization was built on Sumerian mathematics, but nobody knew where Sumerian mathematics came from. Robson closed her files and sat in the growing darkness of her office, listening to the quiet tick of her wall clock, 60 beats per minute. marking time according to rules established before written history began. Outside Oxford's bells chimed the hour in 12-tone sequences that echoed mathematical relationships first encoded in clay 5 millennia ago. The persistence was what troubled her most. Other ancient innovations had been improved, replaced, or forgotten. Egyptian hieroglyphs evolved into other writing systems. Roman architecture was superseded by new engineering techniques. Greek philosophy was refined by subsequent thinkers. But Sumerian mathematics persisted unchanged, as if it had achieved a perfection that couldn't be improved upon, as if it represented not human invention, but inheritance from a source that had already solved the fundamental problems of measurement and calculation, which meant that every second ticking by on every clock in the world was marking time, according to instructions written by minds we could no longer identify, for purposes we no longer remembered, following mathematical principles that arrived in human history fully formed and perfect. And if that was true, if the numbers governing modern life were inherited rather than invented, then we had to ask, who designed the original system? What were they measuring so precisely? And why does their mathematics still work perfectly for applications they could never have imagined? Because somewhere in the silence before the first cuneiform tablet, someone had established the numerical rules that still governed how every human being experienced time and space. Someone had created a mathematical framework so robust that it could survive the collapse of empires, the forgetting of languages, and the transformation of human civilization from mud-brick cities to spacefaring technology. Someone whose identity was now hidden behind 5,000 years of cultural transmission, but whose invisible presence could be felt every time you glanced at a clock and saw 60 seconds, marking time according to their design. And why does that realization that we're still following mathematical instructions written by anonymous minds in prehistoric darkness feel less like discovery and more like remembering something we were never supposed to forget? This impossible precision, this advanced mathematical framework appearing ex nihilo in Sumerian culture, is not merely an anomaly. It is a ghost in the machine of human history. It points relentlessly towards the existence of an ancient race, a predecessor civilization, that mastered these abstract principles and bequeathed them to humanity as a foundational operating system. The questions it raises are not about how humans figured this out, but who else had already figured it out, and why they deemed it so crucial to preserve that they encoded it into the very fabric of our time and measurement systems, ensuring its survival across millennia, even if the originators faded into silence. The silence of the forgotten teachers, the architects of numbers, whose enduring legacy shapes our every moment. We are living their sequel, reading their user manual, but without the original context, without the full understanding of the architects of our earliest civilization. Professor Sarah Chen had translated hundreds of creation myths during her 20-year career in comparative religion, and they all followed the same basic pattern. Gods create the world through force or will, establish their dominance through displays of power, and demand worship from grateful humans who owe their existence to divine intervention. But sitting in her office at Yale's Department of Near Eastern Languages, staring at a fresh translation of the Sumerian text, Enki and the World Order, Chen felt the familiar vertigo that comes from encountering evidence that doesn't fit established patterns. Because the Sumerian gods weren't behaving like gods at all. They were behaving like consultants. The text described Enki, the god of wisdom and water, traveling from city to city in ancient Mesopotamia. But instead of demanding tribute or punishing disobedience, He was conducting what could only be described as an organizational restructuring. He assigned specific roles to each settlement: who would manage irrigation systems, who would oversee brick production, who would handle livestock breeding, who would maintain astronomical observations. This wasn't mythology. This was project management. Chen read through the passage again, noting the peculiar specificity of the divine instructions. Enki didn't just decree that canals should exist. He explained how they should be constructed. He detailed the proper depth for irrigation channels, the optimal spacing between water gates, the seasonal timing for flood management. The text included measurements, angles, and technical specifications that read less like religious poetry and more like an engineering manual. Why were the gods giving tutorials? The question had been troubling her for months as she worked through the broader corpus of Sumerian literature. Every major figure in their pantheon seemed to govern not just abstract concepts, but specific, applied knowledge domains. Enki handled hydraulic engineering and urban planning. Ninsakila, a variant of Ninmah, or another goddess in Enki's retinue depending on text, managed medical procedures and public health protocols. Nabu oversaw record-keeping and data management. Utu regulated legal contracts and solar timekeeping. It was like discovering that the Greek pantheon consisted entirely of university professors, each one teaching specialized courses in different branches of human knowledge. But the most unsettling aspect wasn't the specificity of their roles. It was the consistency. These weren't evolving mythologies that changed with each telling. The Anunnaki maintained the same functions, the same areas of expertise, the same detailed knowledge across centuries of cultural transmission. From Sumer to Akkad to Babylon, their job descriptions remained remarkably stable, as if they were preserving something that couldn't be allowed to change. Chen pulled up her analysis of Enki and Ninmah, a creation myth that had always troubled her. The story described the two gods experimenting with early human creation, with Ninmah molding figures from clay, while Enki provided feedback and modifications. When her initial attempts produced beings with physical limitations, the blind, the lame, the cognitively impaired, Enki didn't reject them. Instead, he carefully categorized each variation and assigned appropriate social roles based on functional capacity. Reading this as religious allegory, it seemed like a crude explanation for human diversity and social stratification. But reading it as encoded instruction, it began to resemble something else entirely: a medical classification system combined with early public health protocols. How do you care for individuals with different capabilities? How do you integrate them into productive social roles? How do you balance individual needs with community resources? These weren't theological questions. These were practical challenges that every civilization faced, encoded in narrative form that could survive the collapse of the institutions that originally developed the solutions. The preservation method was what convinced Chen that something extraordinary was happening in these texts. In a world without mass literacy, how do you maintain complex technical knowledge across generations? How do you ensure that critical information survives political upheavals, natural disasters, and cultural transformations? You embed it in stories that people will remember, repeat, and consider too sacred to alter. The mythological framework wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate preservation strategy, by transforming technical knowledge into divine instruction. The Sumerians had created a cultural immune system that protected essential information from the natural degradation that affects purely secular knowledge. Chen opened her files on astronomical mythology and found the same pattern repeated. Marduk, the Babylonian inheritor of Sumerian cosmic traditions, wasn't just king of the gods. He was described as the deity who established the constellations and set the calendar that governs earthly affairs. The texts attributed to him contained detailed astronomical observations, mathematical calculations for predicting eclipses, and precise seasonal calendars that agricultural communities use for planting and harvesting. Modern astronomers had verified many of these calculations and found them accurate to within fractions of a degree, but they were presented as divine decrees rather than scientific observations, wrapped in mythological language that made them easier to memorize and harder to forget. The implications were staggering. Every time someone checked their watch, they were using a time measurement system designed by unknown minds for unknown purposes. Every GPS calculation relied on angular measurements that traced back to mathematical principles embedded in cuneiform tablets. Every circular measurement, from the wheels on cars to the orbits of satellites, used a 360-degree system whose origins disappeared into prehistoric silence. Modern civilization was built on Sumerian mathematics, but nobody knew where Sumerian mathematics came from. Robson closed her files and sat in the growing darkness of her office, listening to the quiet tick of her wall clock, 60 beats per minute, marking time according to rules established before written history began. Outside, Oxford's bells chimed the hour in 12-tone sequences that echoed mathematical relationships first encoded in clay 5 millennia ago. The persistence was what troubled her most. Other ancient innovations had been improved, replaced, or forgotten. Egyptian hieroglyphs evolved into other writing systems. Roman architecture was superseded by new engineering techniques. Greek philosophy was refined by subsequent thinkers. But Sumerian mathematics persisted unchanged, as if it had achieved a perfection that couldn't be improved upon, as if it represented not human invention, but inheritance from a source that had already solved the fundamental problems of measurement and calculation, which meant that every second ticking by on every clock in the world was marking time, according to instructions written by minds we could no longer identify, for purposes we no longer remembered, following mathematical principles that arrived in human history fully formed and perfect. And if that was true, if the numbers governing modern life were inherited rather than invented, then we had to ask, who designed the original system? What were they measuring so precisely? And why does their mathematics still work perfectly for applications they could never have imagined? Because somewhere in the silence before the first cuneiform tablet, someone had established the numerical rules that still governed how every human being experienced time and space. Someone had created a mathematical framework so robust that it could survive the collapse of empires, the forgetting of languages, and the transformation of human civilization from mud-brick cities to spacefaring technology. Someone whose identity was now hidden behind 5,000 years of cultural transmission, but whose invisible presence could be felt every time you glanced at a clock and saw 60 seconds, marking time according to their design. And why does that realization that we're still following mathematical instructions written by anonymous minds in prehistoric darkness feel less like discovery and more like remembering something we were never supposed to forget? This impossible precision, this advanced mathematical framework appearing ex-Nearian culture, is not merely an anomaly. It is a ghost in the machine of human history. It points relentlessly towards the existence of an ancient race, a predecessor civilization, that mastered these abstract principles and bequeathed them to humanity as a foundational operating system. The questions it raises are not about how humans figured this out, but who else had already figured it out, and why they deemed it so crucial to preserve that they encoded it into the very fabric of our time and measurement systems, ensuring its survival across millennia, even if the originators faded into silence. The silence of the forgotten teachers, the architects of numbers, whose enduring legacy shapes our every moment. We are living their sequel, reading their user manual. But without the original context, without the full understanding of the architects of our earliest civilization, Professor Sarah Chen had translated hundreds of creation myths during her 20-year career in comparative religion, and they all followed the same basic pattern. Gods create the world through force or will, establish their dominance through displays of power, and demand worship from grateful humans who owe their existence to divine intervention. But sitting in her office at Yale's Department of Near Eastern Languages, staring at a fresh translation of the Sumerian text, Enki and the World Order, Chen felt the familiar vertigo that comes from encountering evidence that doesn't fit established patterns, because the Sumerian gods weren't behaving like gods at all. They were behaving like consultants. The text described Enki, the god of wisdom and water, traveling from city to city in ancient Mesopotamia. But instead of demanding tribute or punishing disobedience, he was conducting what could only be described as an organizational restructuring. He assigned specific roles to each settlement: who would manage irrigation systems, who would oversee brick production, who would handle livestock breeding, who would maintain astronomical observations. This wasn't mythology. This was project management. Chen read through the passage again, noting the peculiar specificity of the divine instructions. Enki didn't just decree that canals should exist. He explained how they should be constructed. He detailed the proper depth for irrigation channels, the optimal spacing between water gates, the seasonal timing for flood management. The text included measurements, angles, and technical specifications that read less like religious poetry and more like an engineering manual. Why were the gods giving tutorials? The question had been troubling her for months as she worked through the broader corpus of Sumerian literature. Every major figure in their pantheon seemed to govern not just abstract concepts, but specific, applied knowledge domains. Enki handled hydraulic engineering and urban planning. Ninsakila, a variant of Ninmah, or another goddess in Enki's retinue, depending on text, managed medical procedures and public health protocols. Nabu oversaw record-keeping and data management. Utu regulated legal contracts and solar timekeeping. It was like discovering that the Greek pantheon consisted entirely of university professors, each one teaching specialized courses in different branches of human knowledge. But the most unsettling aspect wasn't the specificity of their roles. It was the consistency. These weren't evolving mythologies that changed with each telling. The Anunnaki maintained the same functions, the same areas of expertise, the same detailed knowledge across centuries of cultural transmission. From Sumer to Akkad to Babylon, their job descriptions remained remarkably stable, as if they were preserving something that couldn't be allowed to change. Chen pulled up her analysis of Enki and Ninmah, a creation myth that had always troubled her. The story described the two gods experimenting with early human creation, with Ninmah molding figures from clay, while Enki provided feedback and modifications. When her initial attempts produced beings with physical limitations, the blind, the lame, the cognitively impaired, Enki didn't reject them. Instead, he carefully categorized each variation and assigned appropriate social roles based on functional capacity. Reading this as religious allegory, it seemed like a crude explanation for human diversity and social stratification. But reading it as encoded instruction, it began to resemble something else entirely. A medical classification system combined with early public health protocols. How do you care for individuals with different capabilities? How do you integrate them into productive social roles? How do you balance individual needs with community resources? These weren't theological questions. These were practical challenges that every civilization faced, encoded in narrative form that could survive the collapse of the institutions that originally developed the solutions. The preservation method was what convinced Chen that something extraordinary was happening in these texts. In a world without mass literacy, how do you maintain complex technical knowledge across generations? How do you ensure that critical information survives political upheavals, natural disasters, and cultural transformations? You embed it in stories that people will remember, repeat, and consider too sacred to alter. The mythological framework wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate preservation strategy. By transforming technical knowledge into divine instruction, the Sumerians had created a cultural immune system that protected essential information from the natural degradation that affects purely secular knowledge. Chen opened her files on astronomical mythology and found the same pattern repeated. Marduk, the Babylonian inheritor of Sumerian cosmic traditions, wasn't just king of the gods. He was described as the deity who established the constellations and set the calendar that governs earthly affairs. The texts attributed to him contained detailed astronomical observations, mathematical calculations for predicting eclipses, and precise seasonal calendars that agricultural communities used for planting and harvesting. Modern astronomers had verified many of these calculations and found them accurate to within fractions of a degree. But they were presented as divine decrees rather than scientific observations, wrapped in mythological language that made them easier to memorize and harder to forget. The implications were staggering. If the Anunnaki represented encoded knowledge rather than religious belief, then Sumerian civilization had developed the world's first distributed information storage system, a cultural database that could survive the destruction of physical libraries, the loss of literacy, even the collapse of the civilization that created it. But encoded memories of what and why had preservation been considered so critical that entire mythological systems were designed around protecting technical information? Chen found herself thinking about the peculiar way these myths handled failure and experimentation. Unlike most creation stories, which described gods as omniscient and infallible, the Sumerian texts acknowledged trial and error, iterative improvement, and systematic problem-solving. Enki and Ninmah went through multiple attempts at human creation before achieving satisfactory results. Enki experimented with different approaches to canal construction before settling on optimal designs. This wasn't divine perfection. It was engineering methodology preserved in narrative form. The medical knowledge was perhaps the most sophisticated. Texts attributed to Ninsakila or Ninmah contained detailed descriptions of herbal treatments, surgical procedures, and diagnostic techniques that wouldn't be formally systematized until much later in human history. But they were presented as divine healing wisdom rather than empirical medical knowledge. Chen had worked with medical historians to analyze some of these passages and found them remarkably accurate. Treatments described in mythological contexts often reflected sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, pharmacology, and disease progression. The success rates suggested extensive clinical experience rather than supernatural intervention. Yet this knowledge was attributed to gods who supposedly dispensed it as divine gift rather than accumulated through human observation and experimentation. The legal and administrative knowledge was equally impressive. Nabu, the god of writing and record-keeping, was associated with texts that contained detailed protocols for contract law, property rights, taxation systems, and judicial procedures. These weren't abstract moral principles. They were practical legal frameworks, sophisticated enough to govern complex urban societies. Modern legal scholars who studied these texts found them comparable to legal systems that wouldn't develop elsewhere for centuries. But they were preserved as divine commands rather than human innovation, embedded in religious contexts that ensured their careful transmission across generations. In the growing silence of her office, Chen found herself confronting a possibility that challenged everything. She thought she knew about the relationship between religion and knowledge in ancient civilizations. What if the Sumerian pantheon wasn't a collection of supernatural beliefs, but a sophisticated information preservation system designed to maintain technical knowledge across potential civilizational disruptions? What if the Anunnaki were never meant to be worshipped as gods, but remembered as teachers whose lessons had been encoded in mythological form to ensure their survival? The preservation wasn't perfect. Over centuries, the technical content gradually degraded as the mythological wrapper became more important than the information it protected. Functions became personalities. Systems became superstitions. Instruction manuals became religious doctrines. But the core knowledge persisted, transmitted through ritual repetition and sacred narrative long after the original context had been forgotten, which raised the most troubling question of all. If these myths were designed as preservation systems, what knowledge was so important that it required such elaborate protection? What technical information was considered so essential that entire civilizations organized their religious practices around maintaining it? And why did the original teachers, whoever they were, believe this knowledge might be lost without extraordinary measures to preserve it? Chen closed her translation files and sat in the deepening darkness of her office, listening to the quiet hum of climate control systems, maintaining optimal conditions for the preservation of ancient texts. Outside, New Haven bustled with the confident noise of modern civilization, unaware that some of its foundational knowledge might be encoded in stories it had learned to dismiss as primitive mythology. But those ancient narratives were still there, waiting in archives and libraries around the world. Patient repositories of encoded instruction written by minds that understood something about the fragility of human knowledge and the necessity of protecting it against the forgetting that comes with time. Because if the Sumerian gods were really memories of human expertise preserved in mythological form, then we had to ask what other knowledge might be hidden in stories we'd learned to interpret as fiction. What other instruction manuals might be disguised as religious texts, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to recognize technical information wrapped in sacred narrative? And why does the thought that we might be surrounded by encoded wisdom we lack the insight to decode feel less like discovery and more like recognition? As if part of us has always known we were reading the stories wrong, missing lessons that someone considered too important to lose. Dr. Amanda Stelzer had been reading Sumerian literature for 12 years, and she thought she understood the difference between mythology and instruction manuals. Myths dealt in metaphors, symbols, and archetypal struggles between cosmic forces. Technical manuals provided precise measurements, sequential procedures, and cause-effect relationships. But sitting in her office at the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, staring at a fresh translation of the creation epic, Enki and Ninmah, Stelza encountered a line that made both categories collapse into something she couldn't classify. The text described the god Enki molding the first human from clay, standard creation mythology, until line 47, which specified that the clay should be mixed with water in a ratio of 3 parts to 1, and kneaded until it holds its shape without cracking. That wasn't mythological language. That was pottery instruction. And once she started looking for it, Stelza found technical specifications embedded throughout Sumerian literature like hidden source code in what appeared to be purely narrative texts. Temple construction myths included bricklaying sequences. Agricultural stories contained planting calendars. Divine pronouncements encoded legal procedures with the precision of constitutional amendments. These weren't metaphors behaving like measurements. These were measurements disguised as metaphors. The realization was profoundly unsettling. If Sumerian myths contained functional technical information, then everything archaeology had assumed about the relationship between religion and knowledge in ancient civilizations needed to be reconsidered. Because these texts weren't just preserving spiritual beliefs, they were operating as distributed technical libraries, encoding practical knowledge in narrative formats, designed to survive the collapse of the institutions that created them. Stelza pulled up her analysis of the Kesh temple hymn, a religious text that had always struck her as oddly repetitive. The hymn praised the construction of a temple to the goddess Nintu, but instead of abstract veneration, it provided step-by-step construction procedures. Let the brick be carried. Let the foundation be laid. Let the walls rise 7 cubits. Let the reed door be hung in the sanctuary. Reading it as poetry, it seemed like ritualized repetition designed to create a sacred atmosphere. Reading it as encoded instruction, it began to resemble a construction checklist that could guide actual building projects across generations. The measurements matched. Archaeological surveys of Sumerian temple foundations revealed construction techniques that corresponded exactly to the procedures described in religious hymns. The 7 cubits mentioned in mythological contexts turned out to be the standard height for temple platform foundations. The reed door specifications matched physical remains found at excavation sites. Someone had been following these mythological instructions with architectural precision. But the most troubling discovery was the me, a concept that appeared throughout Sumerian literature without satisfactory translation. Scholars usually rendered it as divine decrees or cosmic laws. But Stelza's analysis suggested something more specific and disturbing. The me weren't abstract principles. They were discrete packets of technical knowledge. In the epic Enki and the world order, the god Enki distributed me to different regions and cities, each one containing specific skill sets: metallurgy, irrigation, legal frameworks, astronomical observation, textile production, architectural techniques. The myth listed over 60 different me, together comprising what could only be described as a complete civilizational operating system. And they weren't invented by humans. According to the texts, they were delivered from where? By whom? The myths provided no clear answer. Only the insistence that these knowledge modules had been transmitted to humanity as gifts that enabled the transition from primitive survival to organized civilization. Stelza stood and walked to her window, staring out at Chicago's skyline while her mind processed the implications. If the me represented inherited technical knowledge, then Sumerian civilization hadn't developed its sophisticated capabilities through gradual innovation. It had received them as a package deal, complete with instructions encoded in mythological narratives. designed to ensure their preservation across potential civilizational disruptions. The encoding mechanism was what convinced her that something extraordinary was happening in these texts. Modern memory experts used story-based techniques to retain complex information, building memory palaces where data could be stored in narrative frameworks that made abstract information easier to recall and harder to forget. The Sumerians appear to have developed the same technique on a civilizational scale, embedding technical knowledge in mythological narratives that could survive the loss of literacy, the collapse of institutions, even the forgetting of the original context, but embedded so cleverly that later generations would interpret instruction as inspiration, mistaking operational manuals for religious doctrine. Stelza returned to her desk and opened a file containing her comparative analysis of Sumerian construction myths and archaeological evidence. The correspondence was undeniable. Mythological descriptions of divine building projects matched actual construction techniques with mathematical precision. The myth of Marduk establishing cosmic order included detailed specifications for astronomical observation that corresponded to the layout of Babylonian cities. Stories about Enki's water management contained hydraulic engineering principles that matched the irrigation systems found throughout Mesopotamia. Divine pronouncements about social organization encoded legal frameworks sophisticated enough to govern complex urban societies. Someone had been using these myths as functional blueprints, following mythological instructions to build actual infrastructure, which raised an even more disturbing question. If these narratives contained operational knowledge, what happened when the technical context was forgotten but the stories persisted? The answer was all around her. Modern religious traditions preserved mythological narratives that might once have contained practical instruction, but the operational content had been lost while the symbolic wrapper survived. Stories that were once functional had become purely spiritual, their original purpose obscured by centuries of reinterpretation. How much technical knowledge had been lost because later generations forgot how to read instruction disguised as inspiration. In the growing silence of her office, Stelza found herself thinking about the peculiar way these myths handled process and sequence. Unlike most religious narratives, which focused on moral lessons or cosmic truths, Sumerian myths paid obsessive attention to procedural details. What happened first? What materials were required? What conditions needed to be met? What results could be expected? They read less like spiritual allegories and more like technical documentation written in narrative form to make complex information memorable and transmissible across generations of oral tradition. The repetition pattern supported this interpretation. Sumerian myths often contained multiple versions of the same basic story, with slight variations that preserve different aspects of the encoded information, like backup copies of critical files, ensuring that even if one version was corrupted or lost, the essential data could be recovered from alternative sources, and the information was precise enough to function. Temple construction myths contained architectural specifications that worked when implemented. Agricultural stories included planting schedules that corresponded to optimal growing conditions. Legal narratives encoded judicial procedures that could govern actual communities. These weren't approximate symbolic representations. These were functional, operational instructions that produced measurable results when followed correctly. Stelza closed her analysis files and sat in the deepening darkness of her office, listening to the quiet hum of climate control systems, maintaining optimal conditions for the preservation of ancient texts. Around her, thousands of clay tablets and papyrus fragments preserved the written remains of civilizations that had risen and fallen across millennia. But how much of what we called mythology might actually be technology? Operational knowledge encoded in narrative form by minds that understood something about the fragility of human memory and the necessity of protecting critical information against the forgetting that comes with time. The Sumerian texts suggested that at least one ancient civilization had developed sophisticated techniques for embedding practical knowledge in mythological narratives, creating cultural preservation systems that could maintain technical information across potential civilizational collapses, which meant that other mythological traditions might contain similar encoded instruction, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to recognize technical information disguised as spiritual narrative. Because if stories could function as machines, preserving and transmitting operational knowledge across millennia through carefully structured narrative frameworks, then we had to ask what other instruction manuals might be hiding in the myths we've learned to interpret as pure fiction. What other blueprints might be concealed in the stories we tell ourselves about gods and heroes, waiting for archaeologists and linguists clever enough to recognize that some narratives were never meant to inspire belief, but to preserve the practical knowledge necessary for rebuilding civilization itself. And why does that possibility that we might be surrounded by encoded wisdom we lack the insight to decode feel less like discovery and more like recovery, as if part of us has always known we were reading the blueprints wrong? The Anunnaki and the May, those enigmatic entities and knowledge packets, stand as the clearest textual evidence of an ancient race that actively engaged in transmitting advanced civilization to humanity. Their actions, preserved in Sumerian myths, are not simply tales of divine intervention, but meticulous records of instruction, training, and strategic knowledge deployment. This narrative framework, designed to ensure survival across epochal shifts, implies a profound understanding of civilizational fragility and the deliberate efforts required to counter the relentless tide of forgetting. We are not just decoding ancient stories. We are attempting to recover the operating manual for our own existence, a manual left by forgotten teachers who saw the future and built safeguards into the very fabric of human belief. The hill had been hiding in plain sight for 11,000 years. Dr. Klaus Schmidt first noticed it in 1994, driving through the arid landscape of southeastern Turkey on his way to survey other archaeological sites. Local shepherds had always known about the strange stones that occasionally surfaced on the hilltop, but no one had thought to investigate what might lie beneath centuries of accumulated soil and debris, until Schmidt started digging. What he uncovered changed everything archaeology thought it knew about the development of human civilization. Beneath that innocuous hill lay Göbekli, a complex of massive stone circles built around 9600 BC, making it older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, older in fact than agriculture itself, which created a problem that archaeologists were still struggling to resolve. How do you build monumental architecture before you've learned to farm? How do you organize massive construction projects before you've developed cities? How do you create sophisticated symbolic art before you've invented writing? Standing among the T-shaped pillars on a cool morning in 2019, 25 years after the first excavation, Schmidt felt the weight of questions that had consumed his career. The megalithic structures surrounding him shouldn't exist according to every model of human development. They represented a level of social organization, artistic sophistication, and engineering capability that was supposed to emerge gradually from simpler foundations. But Göbekli Tepe had no simpler foundations. It appeared fully realized in the archaeological record, like a monument built by people who already knew exactly what they wanted to create. The pillars themselves were masterworks of Neolithic engineering. Each T-shaped monolith stood up to 18 feet, tall and weighed as much as 20 tons. They had been quarried from bedrock using stone tools, transported across uneven terrain without wheels or domesticated animals, and erected with precision that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of structural engineering and load distribution. And they were covered with carvings that suggested symbolic thinking of remarkable complexity. Schmidt traced his fingers along the relief sculptures that decorated the nearest pillar. Foxes, vultures, snakes, wild boar, aurochs, and abstract symbols that seemed to follow systematic patterns. The imagery wasn't random. It appeared to encode meaning according to rules that archaeologists were still trying to decipher. The most unsettling carvings were the humanoid figures, stylized beings with folded arms, belt decorations, and what appeared to be ritual regalia. They were carved with anatomical precision that suggested the artists were working from direct observation rather than abstract symbolism, but observation of what or whom. In Sumerian texts, we find the Apkallu sages from the deep who brought civilization to humanity after the flood. In Vedic lore, the Nagas, half-human, half-serpent beings of wisdom, dwell beneath the earth and guard secret knowledge. Different names, same archetype. Are these merely projections of the collective unconscious? Or are they memories distorted, refracted through millennia, like light through cracked obsidian? We must ask, what kind of intelligence reveals itself not in monuments of gold or conquest, but in the precision of a cut stone, in symbols buried and rediscovered, always too early, too complex? The farther back we go, the more we find civilizations seemingly emerging fully formed with calendars, astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture, all within a few centuries, too fast, as if knowledge had been reintroduced, not rediscovered. Linear progress does not explain this. Something else must. A transmission, a survival, and if so, then who or what was transmitting? There is a shadow behind history, not malevolent, not divine, but silent, watchful, intact. Maybe that's why these traces are so easily missed. They do not scream. They do not demand belief. They merely exist, waiting for those who choose to see. So why do we look away? Perhaps because what lies at the heart of this possibility is uncomfortable. The idea that we are not the apex of human story, but a recurrence. That our pride is misplaced, our timeline wrong. That we walk not toward progress, but in the footsteps of someone older and wiser. And yet, if they existed, they did not preserve themselves in palaces or treatises, but in the bones of mountains and the angles of stars. What kind of people would do that? What did they know about time? About survival? About us? Or maybe the real question is, why did they disappear? The global library of stone, from Göbekli Tepe to Puma Punktu, to the Dogon's impossible knowledge, speaks not of isolated ingenuity, but of a shared, ancient wisdom. These sites are not mere ruins. They are chapters in a hidden history, a testament to an ancient race that understood the fragility of written records and the enduring power of architecture to encode and transmit knowledge across vast spans of time and cataclysm. They are the fingerprints of a sophisticated predecessor culture, leaving behind clues in the most permanent of forms, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reread the stone archives and remember its true inheritance. The story doesn't begin with creation. It begins with erasure. Dr. Michael Brennan had spent 15 years studying comparative flood mythologies, and the pattern never failed to disturb him. Across every continent, in cultures that had never contacted each other, the same narrative emerged with mechanical consistency. Humanity reaches a certain level of development, becomes troublesome to the gods, and gets wiped clean by water. One righteous survivor receives divine warning, builds a vessel, preserves life, and starts over on a simplified world. Not similar stories, identical structures. Sitting in his office at Harvard's Department of Folklore and Mythology, surrounded by translations from Mesopotamia, India, China, Mesoamerica, and North America, Brennan faced a question that academic archaeology preferred not to ask. How do isolated civilizations develop identical memories of global catastrophe? The conventional explanation was psychological universalism. Flood stories emerged independently because flooding was a common, natural disaster that early societies needed to explain through mythology. But Brennan's analysis revealed something more troubling. These weren't explanatory myths about local flooding. They were preservation myths about civilizational reset, and they all pointed backward, towards something that had been lost. The oldest version came from Sumer, pressed into clay tablets at least 4,000 years ago. The Eridu Genesis described a time when humanity had grown too numerous and too noisy for the gods to tolerate. So the divine council decided on erasure, a flood that would wash the world clean and allow for a fresh beginning. But the god Enki disagreed with this decision. He secretly warned a man named Ziusudra, providing detailed instructions for building a vessel that could preserve life through the coming catastrophe. Ziusudra followed these instructions precisely, loading his boat with animals and supplies before the waters came. After 7 days, the flood receded. Ziusudra opened a window, sent out birds to test for dry land, and made offerings to the gods who had both destroyed and preserved the world. In return, he was granted immortality, not as reward, but as insurance that someone would remember what had happened. The details were disturbingly specific, not the vague metaphors you'd expect from ancient mythology, but practical information about disaster, preparation, and survival, as if the story was designed to function as instruction rather than inspiration. And it had worked. The same narrative structure appeared in every subsequent flood tradition, from the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical account of Noah, each one preserving the essential elements: divine warning, righteous survivor, detailed instructions, catastrophic flood, mountain landing, bird reconnaissance, sacrificial offering, covenant renewal, like backup copies of the same critical file, distributed across cultures to ensure the information couldn't be lost again. Brennan opened his analysis of flood mythology distribution patterns, maps showing how the same story had appeared in civilizations separated by oceans and millennia. The Vedic tradition of Manu and the Great Deluge, Chinese legends of Yu, the Great, and the Cosmic Flood, Hopi stories of the world's destruction and renewal, Incan accounts of Viracocha and the cleansing waters. Each tradition claimed the story as their own origin myth, but the structural similarities suggested they were all remembering the same event or the same trauma. Because the flood myths weren't just about water, they were about memory itself. In every version, the flood represented a break in continuity. The world before the flood was different, more advanced, more populated, more connected to divine knowledge. The world after was simpler, smaller, starting over with fragments of what had been lost. It was like reading multiple accounts of the same computer crash, each one describing the moment when everything had to be rebuilt from incomplete backups. The archaeological evidence supported this interpretation in unsettling ways. Throughout Mesopotamia, excavations revealed flood layers dating to approximately 2900 BCE, thick deposits of riverine silt that marked the violent end of early urban settlements at Shuruppak, Kish, and other Sumerian sites. These geological flood markers corresponded exactly to cultural disruption layers, where sophisticated early civilizations suddenly disappeared and were replaced by simpler societies. But the flooding hadn't been global. It had been localized to the Fertile Crescent, where the world's first complex civilizations were developing, which meant the flood myths weren't describing a planetary catastrophe. They were preserving the memory of a cultural catastrophe that had felt like the end of the world to the people who experienced it. The question was, what had been lost in those waters? Brennan found himself thinking about the peculiar characteristics of post-flood civilizations. The Sumerians who rebuilt after the Great Flooding demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that seemed to exceed what should have been possible for survivors of catastrophic social collapse. Their mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and organizational systems showed sophistication that suggested continuity with advanced knowledge rather than gradual redevelopment from primitive conditions. As if they were reconstructing something they remembered imperfectly rather than inventing something new. The flood myths themselves contained clues about what had been preserved. In every version, the survivor wasn't chosen randomly. He was selected because he possessed specific knowledge or qualities that the gods wanted to maintain through the transition. Ziusudra was described as wise and righteous. Noah was called perfect in his generation. Manu was portrayed as a keeper of cosmic law. These weren't just moral examples, they were living libraries, chosen to carry forward essential information that couldn't be allowed to disappear completely. And what they preserved wasn't just biological diversity. According to the myths, they carried forward the me, those packets of civilizational knowledge that enabled the reconstruction of organized society after the waters receded. But reconstruction from what template? And why was the template apparently more sophisticated than what most post-flood civilizations managed to achieve? In the growing silence of his office, Brennan found himself confronting a possibility that challenged everything archaeology assumed about human development. What if the flood myths preserved the memory of an actual civilizational collapse so complete that it had reset human society to a pre-urban state, forcing survivors to rebuild from fragments of knowledge they no longer fully understood? What if Sumer wasn't humanity's first complex civilization, but its first attempt at reconstruction? The mythological evidence suggested exactly this scenario. The gods' regret after the flood, their promise never to destroy the world completely again, their decision to use more selective pressures in the future. These weren't abstract theological concepts. They were policy adjustments, learned responses to the recognition that total erasure was counterproductive. Even the mythological minds behind the flood had realized that complete destruction led to unacceptable knowledge loss, which meant they had experience with the consequences of civilizational collapse. They had tried total reset before and discovered it was too destructive to repeat. But who were they? The myths described gods making these decisions. But if the gods represented encoded memories of human knowledge systems, then they might have been the survivors of an even earlier collapse. Teachers and knowledge keepers who understood the fragility of complex societies and the necessity of preserving critical information through catastrophic transitions. The flood myths might be describing not one collapse, but a recurring pattern of civilizational rise and fall, with each cycle preserving fragments of knowledge from the previous iteration, while losing other crucial elements to the chaos of reconstruction. And if that was true, then the flood story wasn't just ancient history. It was instruction about the present. Because modern civilization faced the same vulnerabilities that had destroyed its predecessors. Dependence on complex systems that most people didn't understand. Concentration of knowledge in institutions that could be disrupted. Reliance on technologies that required specialized expertise to maintain. If the flood came again, whether as natural disaster, social collapse, or technological failure, how much of what we considered essential knowledge would survive? How many of our own survivors would be capable of rebuilding the systems we took for granted? And how much of what we called progress might actually be reconstruction, guided by half-remembered instructions encoded in stories we'd learned to interpret as primitive? Mythology rather than practical warning. Brennan closed his research files and sat in the deepening darkness of his office, listening to the quiet hum of climate control systems, maintaining optimal conditions for the preservation of ancient texts. Outside, Cambridge hummed with the confident energy of modern academic civilization, secure in its assumption that knowledge once gained could never truly be lost. But the flood myths whispered otherwise. They preserved the memory of a time when advanced knowledge had been lost, when complex systems had collapsed, when human civilization had been forced to start over from fragments and hoped they contained enough information to rebuild something recognizable. And they all ended the same way, with a promise that it wouldn't happen again, coupled with the quiet understanding that promises made by human institutions were exactly as durable as the civilizations that made them, which left one final question echoing through the mythological silence. If every culture remembered the flood, who among us was prepared for the next one? And what knowledge were we preserving in forms that could survive the forgetting that comes when the waters of chaos rise again? The Younger Dryas impact event, a sudden deep freeze around 12,800 years ago, lasting over a millennium, then ending almost as abruptly as it began, offers a compelling geological backdrop to these universal flood narratives. This wasn't merely a climatic anomaly. It was a global catastrophe, likely triggered by cometary fragments striking Earth, igniting wildfires, sending dust into the atmosphere, causing global cooling, meltwater pulses, and floods. The evidence microspherules, platinum layers, high concentrations of iridium across multiple continents is compelling. Yet mainstream academia struggles to fully integrate it. Why? Because accepting it means accepting that any civilization existing before 10,800 BCE could have been wiped out overnight, resetting the global clock and explaining the sudden, fully formed appearance of sites like Quebec, which seems less like a beginning and more like an archive. These ancient flood myths, therefore, are not just allegories. They are the fragmented records of an ancient race's traumatic experience, a collective memory of a previous world that necessitated a complete civilizational reboot. They are the ultimate user manual for survival and reconstruction, carefully coded into narratives to ensure that, even if the physical infrastructure crumbled, the essential knowledge for starting over would persist. The question is, are we reading the warnings or just the stories? The deeper we dig, the older things become. But sometimes what we uncover isn't just old, it's out of place. There is a term in archaeology, OOPRT, out of place artifact. It refers to objects that seem too advanced, too anomalous for their assigned context. Tools buried in coal seems millions of years old. Carvings that resemble airplanes discovered in tombs predating known flight by thousands of years. Maps from the 16th century showing Antarctica's coastline free of ice. something only satellite imaging confirmed in the 20th century. The Peary race map is one such case. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, it charts the Atlantic coastline with uncanny accuracy, parts of South America, Africa, and Antarctica. The precision is baffling. The curvature of the Earth is accounted for. Some coastlines depicted were still covered in ice until at least 4000 BCE, and yet Race himself claimed he had compiled it from much older source maps, ones now lost or hidden. What kind of civilization could have drawn such maps before the last ice age ended? Mainstream historians shrugged and say, coincidence, miscopying, misinterpretation, but the pattern persists. In India's sacred city of Dwarka, long believed to be mythological, underwater explorations uncovered submerged structures, roads, and walls off the coast of Gujarat. Radiocarbon dating suggests the ruins are over 9,000 years old, older than any known city, and yet it barely made headlines. Why does our history resist these findings? There is something almost defensive in the way new data is handled, as though the past must remain fixed, even when evidence shifts beneath it. But what if the discomfort doesn't come from the age of these discoveries, but from what they imply, that there was a time before our time, a people before our people, a history before history? And if they existed, where did they go? Some point to cataclysm, the Younger Dryas impact, the rising seas that swallowed Doggerland, Sunderland, the Beranger land bridge. The memory of these floods persists in myth, but also in geology. We know the oceans rose 400 feet in the span of a few thousand years. Entire continents were submerged. Coastlines vanished. Mountains became islands. How much of civilization drowned with them? Today, over 95% of archaeological sites remain undiscovered, most of them likely beneath the seas. If cities once stood on continental shelves, now underwater, their remains would lie hidden beneath layers of silt, coral, and time, beyond the reach of casual exploration, beyond visibility. What stories are locked in those depths? In the Caribbean, sonar scans have revealed what some believe to be stepped pyramids off the coast of Cuba near Japan. The submerged terraces of Yonaguni raise the same questions: cuts to straight, angles to precise, alignments to deliberate. Yet again, we're told, natural formations. Why does the benefit of doubt always favor ignorance? There is another possibility, that these sites were not destroyed by nature, but abandoned by choice. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Cache Maya, the first humans were made from mud, then wood, then maize. But the ones made of wood, intelligent, strong, yet lacking soul, were destroyed in a great flood. Those who survived became monkeys, or perhaps something worse. Shadows. What kind of memory gives rise to such a myth? Did the ancients encode genetic memory in story? Did they remember not just survival, but failure? Could it be that the ancient race we seek did not perish in disaster, but turned away from the path we're now walking? That they saw where it led and chose silence instead? Some traditions speak of the Watchers. In the Book of Enoch, they were angels who descended to earth, shared knowledge with humans' astronomy, metallurgy, root-cutting, and were punished for it. In Sumerian lore, the Anunnaki descended from the heavens, guided civilization, then withdrew. In Hopi legends, the Kushinas came from the sky, taught the people, then promised to return. The names differ, the pattern does not. Beings who came, who taught, who left, and always a promise or a warning. Why do we reduce them to fantasy? Is it safer to call them myths than to consider they were real? That we are the descendants of a broken dialogue? Maybe the ancients didn't just leave behind architecture. Maybe they left behind questions, riddles wrapped in stone and myth, waiting. Not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they wanted us to remember ourselves. Not just our names, but our origins, our possibilities, our patterns. Because perhaps they knew something we don't, that civilizations rise not by tools, but by wisdom, and fall not from weakness, but from forgetting. So the question remains, are we remembering in time? There's something unsettling about silence in the historical record. Not the natural kind, the silence of time and erosion, but the artificial kind, the kind that feels edited, chosen. When entire epochs go missing, we are told they were prehistory, as if the absence of writing justifies the absence of inquiry. But does ink alone define civilization? Or is that merely the boundary we've drawn to avoid what lies beyond? There is a region in the Sahara known as Tazili Naja. It is a plateau of stone, a fossilized sea of ancient life, where thousands of petroglyphs line the walls of caves, silent, immovable, still. They were drawn between 8,000 and 12,000 years ago, and they show something strange. Figures in helmets, figures with antennas, beings that seem to float, to descend, to commune. They are called the Roundheads, not quite human, not quite animal, eyes too large, limbs elongated, often surrounded by smaller figures in supplication. Anthropologists interpret them as shamans or spiritual guides. But even those scholars admit there is something different here, something other. Some of the depictions look eerily modern, as though the past knew the future before it arrived. Could these have been visitors? Or are we looking at a symbolic record of something more internal? Perhaps the more unsettling possibility is that these were not depictions of gods, but of ancestors. That the ones we call aliens today were once kin, older, changed, hidden by time. This is not isolated. In Val Camonica, Italy. In Hunan, China. In the caves of Kimberley, Australia, the same motifs appear. Figures in radiating suits, round heads, beings surrounded by stars. Not always identical, but close enough to suggest commonality. And what do we do with this pattern? We file it under coincidence. But coincidence wears thin when it repeats across millennia and continents. We might ask, if these beings were imagined, why imagined the same way? If they were hallucinated, why with such consistency? And if they were remembered, then what were they? The Doga figurines of Japan, dated to at least 10,000 years ago, resemble miniature astronauts. Large-eyed, helmeted, jointed, like they wore suits. Archaeologists classify them as fertility idols, an explanation that fits the framework, but not the form. How many fertility idols wear goggles? Why are we so eager to explain away rather than explain? Maybe because the alternative forces us to ask whether something was here before us. Not gods, not myths, but beings. Beings with intelligence, with tools, with culture. Beings who left behind not their bodies, but echoes, in stone, in legend, in instinct. The serpent appears in almost every ancient tradition, not merely as animal, but as symbol. In Mesoamerican lore, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, descends from the stars, brings knowledge, departs with the promise to return. In Egypt, the serpent coils through time, encircling the sunbark of Ra in the Vedas. Kundalini, the coiled serpent energy, sleeps at the base of the spine, waiting to awaken. Why a serpent? Why everywhere? Some say it is the spine, the DNA, the waveform, a symbol of hidden power. But what if it's more than symbol? What if it is memory, not of form, but of transmission? A pattern that once meant something beyond metaphor. There are stories that the ancients could see what we cannot. Frequencies, energy fields, that they spoke in harmonics, built with resonance. The ancients didn't just carve stone, they sang to it. The monoliths at Stonehenge and Newgrange are not simply aligned with solstices. They are chambers of sound. Whisper in one corner and it echoes across the bones. In Malta's Hypogeum, a subterranean temple older than the pyramids, the oracle chamber vibrates at 110 Hz, a frequency that affects the human brain, stimulating parts associated with intuition and emotional processing. Visitors report strange dreams, visions, a sense of presence. Was this accidental, or did someone understand the human mind better than we do now? Were these places temples or tuning devices? What kind of civilization designs with vibration? Not one concerned with walls and armies, not one obsessed with conquest, but one that valued states of being, states of mind. A people who understood the body not as a vessel, but as an instrument, one that could be tuned, awakened, aligned. Could that be why they left so little behind? Because their true legacy was not in stone, but in us. Perhaps they knew the cycles would return. That knowledge would be buried not by disaster alone, but by design, that others, like us, would rise again, confused by fragments, haunted by the sense that something doesn't add up. Maybe that's why they carved certain things in stone. The bare minimum, symbols, alignments, frequencies, not to teach, but to remind. And now the question falls to us. What are we remembering? The sheer volume of out-of-place artifacts and inexplicable constructions, dismissed as anomalies, coincidences, or hoaxes, forms a pattern too persistent to ignore. From the global reach of the Peary race map to the impossible precision of Yanaguни, from the enigmatic roundheads of Tassili to the vibrational architecture of the Maltese Hypogeum, these are not just curiosities. They are the fragmented remains of a global civilization, an ancient race that possessed knowledge of our planet and its deeper forces far beyond our accepted historical timeline. They are deliberate markers, encoded messages left behind by an intelligence that understood the impermanence of empires and the endurance of certain truths, particularly those embedded in stone, symbol, and sacred frequency. The silence that follows their discovery, the academic dismissal, is less about scientific rigor and more about the uncomfortable realization that our cherished, linear narrative of human progress is fundamentally flawed. It's a silence designed to protect a story that prevents us from remembering what we once knew, what was once built, and who was here before. These guardians of the deep, whether physical structures or symbolic echoes, are waiting not to be discovered, but to be truly seen, to be remembered as the legacy of a forgotten race that left us not answers, but the tools to ask the right questions. We search for our origins in layers of dirt and fragments of pottery, as if truth could be pieced back together like a broken vase. But what if the truth isn't buried? What if it's encoded not in the earth, but in the human body? There's something ancient within us, a residue, a rhythm, a whisper that surfaces in dreams or in moments of deep stillness. Not a memory, but a familiarity, as if we are not the first to walk this path, but the latest in a long line of forgotten returns. Modern genetics has opened doors our ancestors never imagined. We can trace ancestry, map migration, isolate mutations. And yet, for all the precision of DNA, there are patterns we don't understand, anomalies we don't talk about, like the 223 genes in the human genome that seem to have no clear evolutionary trail. Genes found in bacteria, but not in any creature between them and us. How did they get there? Some scientists suggest horizontal gene transfer, a process common in microbes but rarely observed in complex organisms. Others shrug, calling it a mystery yet to be solved. But for those willing to peer through a wider lens, another question arises. Could they be remnants? Gifts, leftovers from a contact long ago by a people or beings whose biology wasn't so different from ours. Ancient traditions speak of gods who shaped humanity not from clay but from their own essence. In Sumerian lore, the Anunnaki are said to have mixed their blood with that of primitive hominids to create the first humans. In Genesis, we read that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. In the Popol Vuh, the gods attempted several prototypes of mankind from mud, from wood, and finally from maize. Always the story is the same. Humanity was made, not evolved, formed with intention, engineered. Is that why we appear so suddenly in the fossil record? Is that why, after hundreds of thousands of years of stone tools and slow change, we suddenly, in a geological instant, begin building, speaking, writing, organizing? The Great Leap Forward, as evolutionary biologists call it, is a mystery, a burst of cognitive and cultural complexity that still defies neat explanation. Art, burial, symbolic thought, language, all emerging within a span of millennia, a blink in cosmic time. What happened? Did something awaken in us, or were we awakened? There's an unsettling possibility that civilization is not a natural byproduct of human evolution, but a memory, a reactivation, something already present, lying dormant, triggered by contact, cataclysm, or choice. We assume intelligence moves one way, forward. But what if it pulses? What if what we call evolution is simply the surfacing of what was once submerged? The ancient race may not have vanished because they failed. They may have chosen to step back, to let the world forget and begin again. A cycle not of destruction, but of renewal. Some say their blood runs in certain lineages. That ancient knowledge passed down in dreams, in instincts, in subtle traits, higher sensitivity, heightened perception, a pull toward the stars or the unseen. The idea of starseeds, humans with origins beyond Earth, is dismissed as spiritual fantasy. But what is myth if not a way to preserve truths too strange for the language of science? What if those lineages exist not in royalty or power, but in silence? In the child who draws spirals without knowing why, in the elder who dreams of places they've never seen, in the deep urge some feel to protect the earth, though no one taught them how. Maybe these are not quirks. Maybe they are callings, echoes of an ancestry too old to trace with blood, but present in vibration, because if the ancient race understood anything, it was frequency. They knew that form follows vibration, that thought shapes matter, that consciousness is not confined to the brain, but is a field, one we share, influence, and inherit. The pineal gland, once dismissed as useless, has receptors for dimethyltryptamine, DMT, a molecule that induces intense, often mystical visions. It is produced naturally in many life forms, and appears to activate during birth, death, and dreaming. Why? Why would nature evolve a molecule that opens gateways? Unless they were meant to be opened. Unless the ancients knew what modern science is only beginning to guess. that the body is not a prison but a receiver, that the mind is not storage but signal, and that the soul, if it exists, may be older than earth itself. Perhaps the ancient race didn't give us tools. Perhaps they gave us the map, etched not in stone but in bone, not in ruins but in rhythm. And now, as we decode our own blueprint, as we stare at the double helix glowing on our screens, maybe we're beginning to see it. Not the instructions, but the intention. The pattern, the spiral. The invitation to remember not only who we are, but who we were. And the quiet possibility that hums beneath every question. What if we were designed not to dominate, but to awaken? We are told to seek answers in the ground, in layers of sediment, in fossilized remains, in buried ruins. But some things aren't found below, they're seen above. Across cultures, across millennia, humanity has looked to the stars not as strangers, but as home. The night sky to the ancient ones was not a backdrop. It was a mirror, a guide, a living map of origins, endings, and return. And almost every culture tells of beings who came from the stars. In Egypt, the gods descended from the constellation Orion and the star Sirius, the same two celestial bodies to which the pyramids are aligned in the lore of the Maya. The Pleiades were a place of origin, a cluster of fireflies in the sky from which the first knowledge came. The Mari traced their creation myths to those same 7 stars. The Dogon speak of the Namo, aquatic beings from Sirius who came to Earth long before humans walked it. In China, the Yellow Emperor was said to have descended from a dragon star, bringing with him wisdom, order, and the foundations of civilization. How can so many isolated cultures assign the same stellar homes to their ancestors? And why always the same constellations? Why Sirius, Orion, the Pleiades? We dismiss these as primitive mythologies, metaphors for crops and seasons, stories to explain the unknown. But ancient astronomy was anything but primitive. It was precise, consistent, and far-reaching. They tracked precession over thousands of years. They charted lunar cycles more accurately than modern calendars. They encoded celestial alignments in stone, in city grids, in myths repeated with ritual exactitude. And more than that, they remembered. They remembered the skies not as a mystery, but as memory. Graham Hancock once suggested that the stars may have once been a map for something else, a key not to navigate the heavens, but to understand ourselves. As above, so below, the Hermetic maxim goes. But what if it's not philosophy? What if it's instruction? Many ancient sites around the world mirror the constellations. Teotihuacan's 3 pyramids reflect the belt of Orion. So do the Giza pyramids. The temples of Angkor Wat mirror the Draco constellation, not as it appears now, but as it appeared over 12,000 years ago. How could they have known? And more importantly, why? Why build monuments on earth to match the heavens? Unless those monuments were messages, markers, signals to something or someone watching. We often picture alien contact as loud, obvious, cinematic. But maybe it never was. Maybe the first contact didn't come in ships. Maybe it came as light, as sound, as code. Maybe the ancients didn't just witness visitors from the stars. Maybe they were taught by them, not in language, but in alignment, in the arrangement of sacred sites, in the rhythm of ritual calendars, in the structure of thought itself. Carl Sagan once mused that any sufficiently advanced civilization would not need to conquer or colonize. They would seed, inspire, trigger awakening through subtle architecture, the kind that outlasts empires. Could the ancient race have done just that? Could they have come not to rule, but to plant? Plant knowledge, geometry, memory, and then disappear, leaving only the questions behind. This may explain the strange consistency in origin myths. Always beings from the sky, always a gift of knowledge, always a sudden leap in development. Why do the Dogon describe the orbit of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye and only confirmed by Western astronomers in the 20th century? Why do ancient Sumerian texts describe the outer planets Uranus, Neptune, Pluto with startling accuracy? Why are there stone carvings in Mesoamerica that resemble spacesuits, rocket ships, and beings manipulating strange machines? Are these just metaphors, or are they memories refracted through time, filtered through myth, misinterpreted by modern eyes? We often ridicule what we don't understand. We reduce ancient knowledge to stories, then mock the stories for not being science. But maybe they are something deeper than both. Maybe they are relics of a conversation we no longer know how to continue. And maybe the most unsettling idea is not that we were visited, but that we were never alone to begin with. That a part of us is not native to this planet. That our fascination with the stars is not curiosity but longing. The philosopher Giordano Bruno was burned for suggesting that stars were suns and that other worlds might have life. Today that idea is taken for granted. But he said more. He said we are fragments, that the soul comes from elsewhere, that Earth is not a prison but a school, and we are here to remember. Remember what? Perhaps that we carry in ourselves not just the code of survival, but the echo of something stellar, a frequency not of this earth, but bound to it through form. And maybe the ancient race, whether born of earth or the stars, understood that the real journey is not outward, but inward, through myth, through memory, through the symbols they left behind. They are not meant to be decoded like puzzles. They are meant to awaken. And as we look to the stars, again through telescopes, through rockets, through longing perhaps, the moment is near when we no longer ask, are we alone? But instead, who are we really? This deep dive into our genetic code and the pervasive star ancestor myths reveals a profoundly unsettling hypothesis. The human genome itself may contain the residual imprints of an ancient race. The sudden cognitive leap in human prehistory, the advanced knowledge of distant celestial bodies, the recurring archetypes of sky beings or teachers descending to earth, these are not random cultural artifacts. They are echoes within the helix, signals in our very being, suggesting an intentional intervention, a deliberate awakening rather than a slow, organic evolution. The wisdom passed down was not just in stone or story, but in the blueprint of life itself, a silent invitation to remember our stellar origins, to reclaim a consciousness that understands frequency and resonance, a consciousness that was once perhaps a direct inheritance from a technologically and spiritually advanced ancient race, who understood the true nature of time as cyclical, and built into our very being the capacity to reawaken, to return to a state of knowing that transcends mere physical discovery.